This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
February is, of course, Black History Month, and perhaps no two countries have contributed to our understanding of Black history outside of the continent of Africa than the countries of Jamaica and Haiti. Today, we're joined by scholars Laurent Dubois, talking about a history of Haiti, and we're joined by Deborah Thomas, University of Pennsylvania anthropologist, about violence in the country of Jamaica. This is Left of Black, and I'm Mark Anthony Neal. Good afternoon and welcome back to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Laurent Dubois, Professor of French Studies and History and Director of the Center for French and Francophone Studies, and co-director with Deborah Jensen of the Haiti Lab at the Franklin Humanities Institute here at Duke University. Laurent is also the author of Soccer Empire, The World Cup and the Future of France, A Colony of Citizens, Revolution and Slave Emancipation in the French Caribbean, 1787 to 1804, and a brand new book, Haiti, The Aftershocks of History, which is just published by Metropolitan Books. Thanks for joining us in studio today.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Talk a little bit, and you talk about this very early in the book. There's a new focus on Haiti, obviously, in the aftermath of the earthquake from 2 years ago. And you mentioned Pat Robertson's quote, right? That this is, the deal that Haiti has made with the devil, right? It's kind of a thinly veiled allusion to religious practices in the country. And one of the things that your book really does, in a popular way, because obviously this is work that you've done, for more specific scholarly audiences, right? But for a general popular audience, is really to disabuse folks, who somehow think that Haiti has been the biggest problem in its own kind of history of misery. Talk a little bit about your interest in Haiti and what you were hoping to really accomplish, with this kind of fresh look on its history.
Well, I did decide to write the book after the earthquake, in part because of all this kind of misunderstanding and sort of this exposure, I guess, of a lot of the lack of understanding or ignorance people have, not only about Haiti, but about U.S. involvement in Haiti. And that's a pretty crucial part of the book. So I think, and actually I try to trace the story of this in the book itself, which is that in some ways, instead of knowing about the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which most Americans don't really know that much about, we have inherited a kind of set of stereotypes that really, in some ways, were crafted or carefully honed during that period. So we're not that familiar with our own history in Haiti, but we have all this kind of almost like a cultural unconscious, and that media or figures like Pat Robertson can kind of tap into that is oddly present, because it's like almost as if people have Haiti somewhere in their minds. They don't really know that much about it, but then it can kind of emerge at certain moments, with a kind of stock images.
And it's interesting because it's not really even a black-white dynamic. And, it's very much an American-Haiti dynamic. Right. Because with the exception of Haitian Americans, there are a fair amount of black Americans, right, who kind of buy into this history of Haiti also. Folks who themselves, kind of compare Haiti's religious practices to their understanding of Christianity within black communities. And then, of course, all the rumors about and misunderstandings about AIDS and things like that in the 1980s. What has been the response to work that has tried to really be, in your case, your work, to be much more of a corrective history of our understanding of Haiti?
Well, I think people are. I think first of all, it's our responsibility to take that history and kind of offer it to people in a certain way. So one of the reasons I wrote this is because I talked to a lot of people, I think, journalists and others, who really did want to know, and they didn't. They wanted to have access to an alternative way of looking at this. But I think the response, in general, the response I think is pretty positive, because people do feel, I think if you provide them with documentation and a different kind of story. I do in the book talk a lot about some very fascinating African American figures, everyone from Douglass to James Weldon Johnson to James Theodore Holly, who's the founder of the Haitian Episcopal Church. All these kind of long engagements, but who are also complicated, ambiguous figures often in their own way, to just sort of highlight that. My sense is that, we wrote an op-ed with Deborah a few weeks ago about that was a kind of challenge to and it's true that some people find it very hard to accept that there's a kind of different history of Haiti, that Haiti has sometimes been successful. And I quote at the beginning my colleague Jean Casimir, as a Haitian professor, always talks about Haiti disturbs. And I think that what runs through the book is partly this idea that it disturbs as a kind of challenge. The Haitian Revolution and other forms of kind of political action and social action in Haiti do challenge a lot of kind of reigning models, a lot of ideas about what progress and modernity is. So in that sense, it's also kind of put pressure in some ways on certain African American ideas about what advancement and progress might mean within this country.
We just talked with Deborah Thomas, anthropologist at University of Pennsylvania. She's a great new book on Jamaica and violence,
right.
And particularly kind of the spectacularity of the violence. And she mentions about, for colonial powers dealing with Jamaica during the colonial era, that Haiti was always a reminder of the possibility of a black insurgency. And as it's not well known enough, Haiti is the most successful slave revolt in history of the world in some ways. Talk a little bit about that particular history of insurgency and what impact that has, whether it's first with the French government's refusal to recognize an independent Haiti, the indemnity that begins what becomes 150 years, really of Haiti as a debtor nation. Talk a little bit about the power of that insurgency and what kind of impact it has in the Caribbean, but also generally in this region of the world.
Right. I mean, obviously, the Haitian Revolution signifies this profound kind of challenge on some levels, especially to Jamaica, which is right next door, which is a very similar demographic situation. So the intensity of that revolt, its success not only in actually carrying out a slave insurgency, but also in kind of creating alliances with radical French revolutionaries. I mean, with achieving a kind of geopolitical power, which is quite significant.
The French Revolution was a real inspiration for folks in Haiti, or pre.
And they're kind of able to sort of actually transform the possibilities of that French Revolution and kind of, I mean, I actually argued in my earlier book that they're kind of creating a universalism, the most radical universalism of the time, kind of advancing democratic practice. And so that's a kind of enormous threat. But it's important that Haiti is not only a slave revolt, but that they then create this state. And I do think a lot of the rhetoric, one of the main things I was trying to contest with the book was there's a kind of sense of, well, they had this revolution and then inexorable decline since then, right? It's 200 years of, running around
on black nations.
Right. That just necessarily, of course, once they were free. And so a big point of the book is to say, well, not at all. Actually, Haitian 19th century. I mean, not only did they create a state, but they did also create this kind of alternative agricultural system that was based on kind of independence, autonomy, dignity, an alternative cultural system. All those sorts of things. We talk about it as it's Jean Casimir's term again, but the counter-plantation system, and that in of itself, and the kind of is a dangerous.
I mean, that struggle
story.
to try to maintain a plantation economy. But to get rid of slavery within that same context, right? And then ultimately it's a failed experiment, right? But it is a group of folks who are kind of imagining outside the box.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's what there are is there's a kind of attempt to recreate plantation economy, which never works in Haiti. I mean, there's a kind of resistance to that. But there is an export style economy that uses coffee and other goods that is actually successful. In other words, I think sometimes people imagine that people just kind of, retreated from the world or something. But Haitian peasants in the 19th century were quite involved with the kind of outside world in the economy, and so that's I think not so well known either. And so it's actually an alternative that later Jamaican farmers, in the post-emancipation era and in the 20th century would also try to explore. Obviously, very challenging within the global economic order, but I think we need to kind of cultivate a sense of all those alternatives and also look to that history, I think, as a set of inspirations, for different modernities or different ways of living in the present.
You're watching Left to Black, and we're joined by Laurent Dubois, professor of French Studies and History here at Duke University and the author of the new book, Haiti, The Aftershocks of History. That's a new publication from Metropolitan Books. Great review in the New York Times of it, and congratulations on that. You mentioned in the book, and it was something that was actually really surprising to me, that they have this kind of ceremonial funeral for John Brown. And so when you think about life in this particular region of the country, right? Whether we're talking Jamaica or black enslaved African Americans in the American South, there is this kind of triangular, right? There's this kind of traffic that's going on and understanding of what's going on. Talk a little bit about the relationship of African Americans. There is this significant immigration of African Americans to Haiti. Talk a little bit about what kind of impact they have on the everyday life of Haiti in that period of time, and what that influence even looks like going forth into the 20th century.
Right, right. Yeah, and that connection, I think, is, first of all, we need to know a lot more about it.
Yeah.
We live here in Durham, where there's a neighborhood called Haiti. There's a lot, interesting things about Durham itself. There's an emigration in the 1820s and again in the 1860s, and that's not unique in the sense that a lot of people emigrated to Haiti in the 19th century, another little known thing. But African Americans played a big role in terms of shaping that relationship with Haiti. I mentioned earlier James Theodore Holly, who goes in the 1860s, founds the Haitian Episcopal Church, which is the first national church in Haiti, remains a very important institution in the country. And so there are back and forth links. But even before that, AME missionaries are traveling to Haiti in the 1820s, 1830s. So there's a long story of and it's not just in urban areas, but also I think in rural areas. So there's a lot to kind of excavate there that we still don't know that much about. I mean, there's some students really starting to work on that at Duke and at UNC. The other thing, though, is there's a kind of irony, too, in the sense that Frederick Douglass, who becomes an ambassador, actually all the early ambassadors to Haiti in the 1860s are African-American, Ebenezer Bassett and others. Douglass is sent to try to negotiate a kind of acquisition of a port in Haiti and becomes torn between these different sides.
Forces,
and then there's ambiguities about even the positions of people like Du Bois and Booker T. Washington at the time of the U.S. occupation, as they do not take very direct stance against it. It's James Weldon Johnson who becomes a really strong critic, but a lot of other African American leaders suggest, for instance, they should send African American troops to Haiti and not white troops, but don't actually critique the project. So you have that, and then in the 20th century, an enormous amount of kind of cultural back and forth. So I mentioned Langston Hughes translating Jacques Roumain, who's a Haitian writer, and obviously Catherine Dunham. And there's a kind of whole story in the 40s, 50s of kind of African American Haitian influences.
One of the things I think is interesting in terms of how you frame the book, and it's ironic, right? You mentioned this earlier, there's such a lack of American knowledge of the history of Haiti. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the ways that Haiti and the U.S. really grow up together.
Right.
But really different directions.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about that relationship when Haiti becomes particularly critical to U.S.'s economic interests. Mm-hmm. The emergence of the steamboat, makes it even more so. But then that moment of occupation, and what that means for the future of Haiti throughout the 20th century.
Right. I mean, even in the 18th century, the Haitian economy helps to sustain the New England economy, and so there's a connection all the way back in the 18th century. And again, it's often people, I think that since they refused recognition to Haiti, which was true. Right. The United States didn't recognize until 1862.
You mentioned the U.S. and the Vatican, right?
Right, are the
like
last two.
Holdouts,
waited until the 1860s. And but that did not mean that Americans did not trade with Haiti, because there was money to be made, and they were perfectly willing to. So you kind of have this dual policy that was there's economic trade and refusal of recognition, which is pretty interesting. But so you have a lot of back and forth with Haiti. Of course, a lot of it starts to change in the late 1890s when the United States really begins to kind of expand into the Caribbean, the Panama Canal, and basically, if you look at a map of the Caribbean, you'll see that there's a little channel between North America and Central America. On one side, there's Guantanamo Bay, and on the other side, there's Haiti and a place called the Mole Saint Nicolas, and both of those became the kind of foci of interest. Right. And Haiti was oddly, kind of paradoxically, more of a kind of, let's say, of a target for U.S. Expansion because it was independent, so that because it was not a colony of England or Spain. So. But the economic interests in Haiti are, of course, relate to those in Cuba and Puerto Rico and the DR, and Haiti is kind of seen as a kind of another space for an expansion of corporations. What is really interesting is that, in a sense, those projects really never work in Haiti. There's a kind of resistance and a refusal to them that is actually quite striking. Kind of parallels, and Haitians often make the correlation with their resistance to baseball. They unlike these other countries, they say stuck with Cuba, soccer, right? But there's a way in which it is interesting that although there's been so many efforts to rebuild plantations in Haiti, it has never worked, basically. It has worked on some small scales, but there's that kind of, which is intriguing and I think an important part of the story.
Almost kind of cultural memory.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it is quite clear that there's a sort of resistance to that, and so.
And the excuse for the occupation, of course, is that is Haiti's debt again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, to American banks. So that's a great reason for us to come in and
there's the debt, there's political instability, and underneath it. I mean, at the time when the State Department seeks Haiti experts, they basically go to these guys who are trying to build railroads, and but it's a pretty striking story too, because I think like a lot of occupations, I mean, it begins they were not, I think, at all intending to stay 20 years. It ends up being a really brutal occupation. There's a long kind of war and intense warfare there. It also helps to kind of generate and produce a whole kind of political and intellectual culture in Haiti throughout the 20th century. So it's a really crucial turning point in the history.
Recent Haitian history, two very different American presidential figures who developed two very different relationships with Haiti. Bill Clinton, when Aristide is forced out, forcefully forcing them back in, and George Bush really kind of turning a blind eye, to that situation 12 years later. Talk a little bit about where U.S. relations are with Haiti now. I mean, there's clearly been a kind of outpouring of support, to the country in the aftermath of the earthquake. Folks who haven't thought much about that relationship are now focused on it. There still was very much those resonances of Katrina, that I think also framed how people responded to Haiti, both in positive and negative ways. But what's the state of that relationship now? Right.
Well, it is, I mean, first of all, about half of American households gave to Haiti disaster relief, which is kind of extraordinary, a lot of generosity. A lot of people from the United States went down after the earthquake, a lot of Haitian Americans and others who went.
It's almost a defining kind of generational moment for college students, who decided to give up summers and give up spring breaks to go volunteer in Haiti. I think that's really surprising to a lot of folks.
It is interesting, and I mean, when you take a plane to Haiti now, it's very different than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. There's just tons of Americans going to Haiti, right? And it's interesting because there's still an image of Haiti as being really dangerous, but any plane you go on, there's 40 people from Iowa who are going. There's also, but I mean, interestingly, just when I was in Haiti recently, this UN homicide report, global homicide report came out, and the statistics show that Haiti is actually one of the safest countries in the Americas for homicide rates. It's lower than Costa Rica, far lower than Jamaica. It's about the same as Cuba, which is kind of intriguing too. But the question about so Americans are really involved in Haiti. Lots of Americans are going to Haiti. People are involved in many, many diverse projects. The government continues to have involvement. And of course, the Haitian diaspora is taking an increasingly prominent role as well. This is a diaspora up to 2 million people. Someone like Martelly, the new president, has a lot of links to U.S. as well, is thinking about diaspora politics. So it's an interesting configuration. It's really fragmented. I mean, the U.S. government has always had a very fragmented, complicated, often at odds with each other relationship. So even Clinton's role with regards to Haiti policy sometimes would put him at odds with other parts of the government. And so all those are very complex. I think right now what we have is a changing situation, a really shifting one, and it's interesting to think what the future holds for it. But it's hard to know exactly where that's going to go.
Talk a little bit about some of the work that you do with Haiti here at Duke, the Haiti Lab, which you co-direct with Deborah Jensen. Talk a little bit about that work with the Franklin Humanities Institute.
Well, we at the Haiti Lab basically are focused on bringing humanities together with law, with health, with ecology, and other areas. It's about bringing graduate students, undergraduates, and faculty together on various research projects. So there's a lot of collaborative research projects, an art project that we did, an art installation. And so it's a kind of experimental space in terms of trying to see what happens. We put humanities at the center of it with language, history, culture, insisting on kind of the need to that sort of a starting point to think critically about the situation in Haiti and U.S. approaches to Haiti and so forth. But what we're finding is that our students are able to kind of use that space and the training in Creole, because we have a 1.5 semesters Creole course that you can take at Duke. So it's actually, I think, maybe the most offered at any university. It's in the Romance Studies department. And that, of course, enables students to really, kind of arrive at a much higher level in terms of what they're doing.
C.L.R. James, the great black thinker from the early 20th century, of course, wrote a great book on cricket. And you took some time out 2 years ago to write a book about soccer, and particularly entitled the World Cup. Talk a little bit about what it's like trying to integrate, what clearly is a more kind of popular work, that resonates well beyond spaces like Duke. You have a blog, Soccer Politics. Talk a little bit about integrating that kind of work with the regular, not regular, but with your normal scholarship.
I mean, in some ways, actually, honestly, that's become kind of a major focus. And this book,
did you play or do you play?
I play soccer badly, like a sort of middle-aged, professor would, but I do enjoy playing. But I also watch passionately, and just I'm kind of interested in the cultural politics, and certainly that C.L.R. James book was a great inspiration. I mean, people do accuse me of following C.L.R. James around because I wrote a book about the Haitian Revolution and then a book about soccer. But It's true that I really think these sorts of cultural forms, and it's true in the book on Haiti too, that the whole issue of kind of cultural representations and cultural politics, and I find that to be a really vital sort of entry point into understanding all these kinds of broader issues. And for me, sport is an incredibly useful way, to apprehend so many different things. But it's also true that through the blog and the soccer book and then this book, I mean, the whole point is in a sense to dialogue with a much broader audience, and there's a kind of, it's been really exciting through the blog and through other mechanisms just to intersect with and interact with a global sphere of people who are interested in these topics, and that's sort of going on around the Haiti book as well. So.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Laurent Dubois, who is a professor of French Studies and History, and you have an endowed chair name. What is that?
It's the Marcello Lotti Chair.
Thank you.
Yes, it's a Bass chair, yeah.
Director of the Center for French and Francophone Studies here at Duke, and also co-director with Deborah Jensen of the Haiti Lab, which is housed in the Franklin Humanities Institute. The author of several books, including 2010 Soccer Empire, The World Cup and the Future of France, and most recently, brand new book published by Metropolitan Books, which is part of the Holt family, Haiti, The Aftershocks of History. Thank you for joining us, Laurent.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
What a war to boss a cabinet singing what a war.
Now, today is the first day of independence for the latest new nation of the Commonwealth, Jamaica.
What a war to boss standing cabinet singing what a war.
It really was the Bustamante government's first clash with the Rastafari.
And Mr. Bustamante said, carrying all Rastaman, dead or alive. Bringing all Rasta, dead or alive. What book can't hold, Bogil will hold them.
When him said the jail can't hold them, throw them on Bogil. Bogil is a cemetery in Mobile. That means to kill them.
Bustamante come blind now. The second one come dead now. And Mr. Shearer can't shear out himself.
My name is Selborne A. Reed. I'm an ex-Jamaican policeman, retired detective inspector. In our shooting range, the targets were oftentimes the image of a Rastaman with locks, and in our mind, that was the look of a criminal.
We have a responsibility, and we have to make sure that this government is answerable to what happened to Rasta in 1963. And we say this without any apology.
Did you know?
Good afternoon and welcome back to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Deborah Thomas, professor of anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, and the brand new book, Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica. Deborah Thomas is also the co-editor of the volume Globalization and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness, and also the co-director and co-producer of a new film, Black Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens. How are you doing this afternoon, Deborah?
I'm very, very good, Mark. Thanks for having me on your show.
We're so happy to have you on the show. You got a lot of stuff going on now. the idea of being able to publish both a book and also to release a new documentary film at the same time. And they really do kind of bleed off of each other in certain kinds of ways. You open the book talking about this cliche of violence that's associated with Jamaica, and in some ways your unwillingness to have to engage that violence. I mean, it's great when you tell this story about when folks think about anthropologists and doing field work, they think about doing certain kind of labor in Africa, another kind of labor in parts of Asia, but when they're talking the Caribbean, it's always about this kind of notion of violence. Talk a little bit about the production of this cliche of violence that's associated in particular with Jamaica.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's either violence or it's sex tourism, right?
Right.
These just happen to be the things that seem to circulate within an international public sphere. Usually for Americans, it's more the vacation destination, particularly Jamaica. It's Rasta and reggae, and it's some sense of a paradise somewhere that's occasionally punctuated by a certain kind of violence and political violence in particular that they don't really have a foundation to understand. Mm-hmm. Whereas people in the UK, though it's often also a tourism destination, they have the colonial history and the colonial sort of connections. So they sometimes tend to have a little bit more information about what that political background is. So are occasionally not quite as surprised by the reports of violence. But the region as a whole, I think, aside from, again, the tourism stereotype between Haiti, Jamaica, and Latin America, mm-hmm. is associated with violence, with the international drug trade, with an international arms trade. And these are sort of stereotypes that tend to be reproduced and represented through popular media and film. I think of like Bad Boys 2, right. with the scene at the beginning where they're going into a house and it's supposed to be Haitian, right. Dreadlocked Haitian drug dealers. So these are just things that become associated with the region at the expense of thinking through these places as places where people are living ordinary lives and have ordinary concerns, and that we need to understand these concerns and lives within a much broader and deeper historical context.
And it's not even just the violence. I mean, there's a certain kind of performative aspect to the violence, the spectacularity of the violence. And part of what you suggest, to counter, popular narratives to suggest that, at least in contemporary Jamaica, these are folks kind of consuming American violence, via film and television. You're arguing in part, in the book, that there's a deeper history of this violence associated with the colonial moment and how colonial powers and planters chose to deal with Black bodies in that context.
Right, right. People are often really stunned when they hear certain kinds of reports of violent acts and things that are going on principally in Kingston, though, often now elsewhere as well, as gangs tend to spread throughout the country. They're often very shocked by, as you say, the level of spectacularity. I mean, people aren't just murdered, they're buried and then exhumed and shot again, or they're dismembered and strewn along a roadside, or, these sorts of things that just seem sort of insanely spectacular, and people come away from them asking, well, why is this so? And often the response is, these people as a whole are just nuts, right?
Yeah, right.
And part of the point of the book, of course, is to show that, everything has a history, and the histories are very intertwined. Yes, part of it is about American economic domination and the kinds of representations one might see, but there's a much longer colonial structural history where, in fact, you would see some of these very forms of performative violence enacted on plantations, slaves who attempt to escape or lead rebellions, beheaded, their heads placed upon a stake, which is then located at the entrance to the plantation, obviously as, a deterrent to future rebellions and future would-be leaders of rebellions. So I don't want to draw an easy line between A and B, the colonial slavery moment and today, but I do think that these histories continue to circulate and that colonial structure provides a foundation for some of the kinds of things that we see today.
Right. And you mentioned we're going to be talking with Laurent Dubois about his new book, Haiti, the Aftershocks of History.
Yeah, I just got the mail today.
And this notion that part of what folks are also dealing with in colonial Jamaica, right, is, all these folks are concerned about the kind of insurgency that's coming from Haiti. And this becomes another reinforcement, to really discourage folks, from taking on and linking to that insurgency that's happening in other parts of the Caribbean.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly after the Haitian Revolution, slave codes were more entrenched and became more draconian in every single slave colony throughout the region.
So talk a little bit about the film Bad Friday. This kind of brings us to a closer contemporary moment, and particularly the violence that's directed at the Rastafarian community, right at Jamaican independence. And it all comes to a head in this particular event, known as Coral Gardens. Talk a little bit about, the relationship that the Rastafarian community has in Jamaica, in the mid-20th century, and how they get identified, criminalized really, within the context of this new nation that's developing at this time.
Yeah. Well, certainly Coral Gardens had precedent, right? There's a long history ever since the founding of Rastafari in 1930 of state and civilian harassment of Rastafarians and of Rastafarian camps throughout Jamaica, in part because they were advocating a philosophy and a sense of selfhood that was completely antithetical to the sort of colonial model for what it would mean to be a citizen in a democracy, because the labor rebellions happened throughout the region in the late 30s, and that spurs this movement towards self-government across the British West Indies. But that model for citizenship was one that was really rooted in a kind of what Diane Austin Bruce calls a Christian Black mentality, self-sufficiency, pecuniary, moderate, participatory, frugal sort of, person who would then participate in the economy and in the political life of the country in a kind of moderate manner that's rooted in a kind of British tutelage. And Rastafarians rejected all of this. First, they rejected the legitimacy of a Jamaican state. Right? Instead, seeking a homeland in Africa. Second, they rejected any kind of supremacy of the British or a white colonial order, instead advocating a kind of Black supremacy at its most militant, but in its more moderate form, certainly a sensibility that saw Blackness as the legitimate foundation for personhood throughout the Black world. They also advocated a removal from the tenets of capitalist development, which was not, the direction of anybody anywhere in the world at the time. So they did not subscribe to, the sort of norms, the general norms of nation building at that time, and therefore were seen as a threat because they also were effective in communicating their ideas and in mobilizing people within communities. They had precedent with Garvey, of course, and prior to that, other kind of Black consciousness movements. So they have been vilified really since their founding by the state. This incident in 1963 is probably in some ways the least well known among the population as a whole, though it is now sort of becoming more known and people seem to be more willing to talk about it at this point. But an investigation was never done, people were never called to account, and the government has never been asked to account for the action. So that's I had known about Coral Gardens, but not very much, and I felt that it was not really a moment in Jamaican history that had been subjected to a lot of analysis. So I became interested to find out really from people who went through that experience what had happened, why it had happened, and really, because they commemorate it now every year, what they're trying to do with the commemoration. So it started out really just being a chapter in the book, a chapter about state violence against Rastafari, and one thing led to another, and we ended up making a film. So.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by University of Pennsylvania anthropologist Deborah Thomas and talking about her new book, Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and her new film, which she co-directed and co-produced, Black Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens. I was struck by a couple of things in the film. There's a point where you juxtapose these images of black schoolgirls, Jamaican schoolgirls. They're wearing their uniforms, they're singing these songs. You know, it reminded me of this certain performance of black respectability that we see in contemporary African American life. And then, of course, that's juxtaposed to the images of young male Rastafarians. And then there's the conversation with the police officer who talked about when they would go to the practice range. And all the targets were set up to look like Rastafari. So in their minds, there was always this direct connection between criminality and outsiderism and the Rastafarian community. And it raises questions, particularly with the killing of Rudolph Franklin, about how much of this really is the state looking for excuses you know, to move Rastafari, you know, I mean, there's a literal displacement, of course, that's occurring within the country, but to really have a blatant excuse to go after the Rastafarian community.
Yeah, certainly, and not just the state, which had a very long-term harassment campaign against Pinnacle, which was the first Rastafari camp in St. Catherine that was finally dismantled in 1954, after almost 20 years of invasion by the security forces, but not just the security forces, really also a general population, civilians. In respect to the Coral Gardens incident, it was really civilians who joined with the security forces and who were asked to join the security forces by the government at the time in rounding up all Rastafari in their areas. So in many cases, some of the elders who we spoke with said, you know, these are people with whom they shared food on a regular basis, who were then turning on them, basically, and collecting them and beating them, really, women, children, you know, taking them into the police stations, into the arms of the security forces across Western Jamaica. Not just Western Jamaica, but primarily Western Jamaica. So definitely there has, and it's not as if the Coral Gardens incident was the end of it either. Really, up through the end of the 20th century, Rastafari had experienced continual harassment. Dreadlock children were not allowed in the schools. It's only recently that some of that kind of pressure has eased up.
You know, it's this incredible irony, right? When you think of Jamaica in 2012 in the early 21st century, in some ways Rastafarianism, you know, is one of the country's biggest export. You know, what is the relationship to the state to Rastafarianism now, given the fact that in some ways it makes the state most visible at this point? Right.
Well, truly, you know, as you know, people always say prophet is never recognized in his homeland. So it's even, you know, the Jamaica Tourist Board, for example, did not use reggae music in their advertisements until the 1990s. So certainly Jamaica is known all over the world for reggae music and Rastafari. But, you know, it takes people locally a longer time to catch up with that. I think you can credit middle-class Black consciousness to the Rastafari movement, really, from the 70s to now. I think now the position of the state is changing somewhat. I mean, there are developments that are happening. One is that, you know, in a way that is very complicated, I think the state is trying to think about incorporating Rastafari into what they call brand Jamaica, you know, in terms of selling the country for tourism, for development initiatives, etc. And they're working with members of the Rastafari community to do this. But on another level, and perhaps a level that's more important to the community of people who we worked with on this documentary, the Jamaican public defender has now agreed to start investigating the Coral Gardens case. So he asked us for our raw interview footage with the elders who appear in the film, and they've been doing their own investigation, taking sworn testimony from elders in Western Jamaica. They went out last August, and now I know that the lead investigator is sort of pouring through the boxes of records in police stations in Trelawney, in Hanover, in Westmoreland, in St. James, the parishes that were the most affected during the Coral Gardens events, and they are trying to put together a case against the government, really. They will present their findings to the government. Depending on the response of the government, they would then present them to Parliament, and depending on the response of Parliament, the public defender said he would take it to the Inter-American Court of Justice. So there is movement, and there is, I think, a sense that there's been persecution over the years, for sure. So, it's moving forward, and we're happy to be able to support the community in these efforts.
And so I'm going to change directions a little bit for you, Deb. We're here with Deborah Thomas, Professor of Anthropology, University of Pennsylvania. Julie Dash was here in September of this year, and one of the things that got screened when she was here was her film Praise House. And lo and behold, as we're watching the film, we see a very young, or younger, Deborah Thomas, who was then a member of the Urban Bushwoman. And I remember Julie Dash had specifically referencing how you could do these backflips and these range of athletic things that made you so important to the project. And you mentioned very early, in your new book that, part of what attracted you to really go back to Jamaica to work is this idea that artists have the capacity really to bring about certain modes of social change. So talk a little bit, if you will, in these closing moments about, the connection between your life and as a dancer and how that really informs the work that you do as a scholar and filmmaker now.
Sure. Well, the only reason I got into this scholarship thing was really through dance. I had worked in college on using this with George Bass at Rights and Reasons at Brown University, using a kind of research to performance kind of community development model for theater, and was really moved by that. And after I graduated, I spent some time in New York. I was dancing there, and then I went to Brazil for a year. I was dancing there, mainly working with people who were incorporating traditional Afro-Brazilian dance and music forms into a modern dance vocabulary, concert dance. And then when I came back, I started dancing with Bushwomen, and that's one of the things that became very attractive about the company, is that we began to do these kind of community engagement projects, which was using dance and music, working with grassroots organizations to achieve whatever the goals that they set out to achieve for themselves. And so I felt like, well, we're doing this on a grassroots level, which is fabulous and interesting, but I wonder if this ever happens on a national level, and how artists have been involved more directly in nationalist struggles. And as you know, my father's Jamaican. I spent some years of my early childhood there, and in Jamaica, dancers were integrally involved in the nationalist movement, certainly in the cultural nationalist movement, trying to sort of transform people's ideas of what is valuable, what is a valuable cultural heritage, when Blackness had been so denigrated. Even dancing barefoot was, scandalous until the 60s or 70s, really. So that's how I got into it. I was going to apply for grants as an independent researcher and try to do some of this work, and my father suggested that maybe if I went to graduate school, someone would pay me to do it. So that's how I ended up in graduate school. And so, in a way, I love the scholarship, I really do, and I love the academic conversations that we have and the theoretical work that we do and thinking through these issues and the political implications of these issues. But the film has really brought me back into the space of being a performer and sort of presenting it publicly and having these kind of public discussions where we're able to invite people from the community to travel up and talk about what's going on now. And, so it's really a nice kind of merging of my two worlds.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Deborah Thomas, who's Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, the author of Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, and also the brand new Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica. Both of those are published by Duke University Press. And she's a co-producer and co-director of Black Friday, Rastafari, After Coral Gardens. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Deb.
you. Thank you.
Say hello to the children, and of course, and John Jackson. Give him a shout for us.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.